You are listening to the We Need to Talk About Oscar podcast. This is our interview with Shōgun Ep1&2 director Jonathan van Tulleken and cinematographer Christopher Ross. We typically like to start our interviews by asking our guests about their core memories that made them fall in love with films and filmmaking as well. Can you recall a moment or time in your life which you can associate one of these feelings with?
When I was growing up, when I was very little, we had only a couple of VHS tapes. And one of those VHS tapes was the making of Star Wars and Indiana Jones. And I think it had been recorded off the TV. It wasn't like a bought tape. We'd recorded it. And it was amazing. It had all this stuff about blue screens and about miniatures and, you know, how they did the stunt work. And it was just, we watched it over and over, you know, as you did when you only had those single VHS tapes. You know, my brothers and I watched it over and over and about how in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, you know, the guys sort of fall off onto a blue screen mat and then they like painted a matte painting in underneath them. And you know, and that really blew my mind. And near us, because I was in West London, I grew up in Hammersmith, you know, we were near Pinewood Studios, sort of relatively. And, you know, one of my neighbors had been a Gromorian guard, and the truck that was used in Indiana Jones and I guess the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where the guy climbs underneath on the rails, was actually at an old garage, parked up at an old garage near us. And my dad showed me underneath, you could see the handrails they'd welded in so the stuntman could climb underneath it. So it was just that idea of going, wow, like they actually make these things. And to me, that was always kind of more intriguing, weirdly, than the films themselves. And I was very into Jim Henson as well. So I was very into Labyrinth and the puppets. And I was really into animatronics and how those worked. And spitting image as well, which was another thing in England that had very, you know, which was very funny, but it also had these great animatronic puppets. And my dad would take me to the exhibitions of, you know, Henson's work and things like that, and the Museum of the Moving Image in London. So I was sort of always obsessed with how stuff got made. My dad's an artist and an industrial designer, and my mum was an editor. So they were very encouraging of kind of, you know, art, but also they were both involved in art in a very sort of, I guess in the production side of it, you know, as an editor or as an industrial designer, you're very hands-on in it. It's like a practical way of dealing with art. And so it was very exciting to me as a kid. It was always very hands-on. And so it wasn't as much about filmmaking. It was more about like, how do they do this stuff? How do they make these stories come to life, these crazy puppets and these spaceships? And I was into model building and all of that. So to me, it was very, you know, it felt like I'd always had that interest, and that just kept with me as I got older. That fascination, just stayed on.
So I remember the first copy of American Cinematographer that I ever read was given to me by a friend of my older brother, who was sort of working in theatre and making props and various things. Wasn't really in the film industry at the time, but he gave it to me and said, and it was the Terminator 2 edition of the magazine, and he told me when he handed it to me that it was like a film school in a magazine. I was 15 years old at the time, and that glimpse behind the curtain at the Wizard of Oz and all the things that was achievable in the world of film was what really spurred me on. And then around about the same time, maybe like a year later, I was gifted a copy of a book called Scorsese on Scorsese. And in that book, I think he just completed Goodfellas. And so it was a lot about Mean Streets and a lot about Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. And he wrote so eloquently about his relationship with Michael Bauhaus and Michael Chapman, and about the Archers, you know, Emmerich Pressburger and Michael Powell, and their relationship with Jack Cardiff. And for me, it was I didn't really ever think that I was cut out to be a director, but I definitely knew that I could be a helpful filmmaker in some capacity. And so to learn that there was a place that bridged science and art, and that role was the role of cinematographer, was such an epiphany to me. And then I spent the next 15 years of my life trying to get to a place where someone would ask me to be a DP. And I'm so privileged that it's a career that continues to sustain me, both from a family perspective and artistically. Yeah, it's the best job in the world.
As I was scrolling through your IMDb pages, I saw that you both worked on Misfits, but maybe you haven't crossed paths back then. So I would guess Top Boy Season 2. Generally, how did you two end up working together in the first place?
Yeah, so I met Chris on Misfits. So I came in on season 3 of Misfits, but I actually shot a short film of the death of one of the main characters on Misfits at the end of season 2. It was like a little short film, an addendum to the season. I think Misfits was the first British TV show when I watched season 1 and what Chris had done on it with the two Toms, and Tom Green particularly. It kind of blew my mind that it was the first thing I'd ever watched on British TV that felt sort of cinematic, that felt very contemporary, that sort of felt on par with anything that I was seeing in America, that it felt like a very, very new way of filming things. And I was immediately like, oh my God, I just come out of film school. And so I got to do these short films. And in doing it, Chris was so sweet. I sort of bumped into him while he was tech scouting the main unit that they were tech scouting to actually shoot the season. And I was doing this sort of the final block, I guess it would have been, Chris. And I was setting up to make these crazy little behind the scenes shorts. And Chris was so sweet and just was chatting to me and like totally engaged and sort of treated me like I was just one of the other directors. And yeah, but I felt like that sort of immediately we sort of became friends in my mind. And so when I went to do Top Boy, I mean, it was like, it's got to be Chris Ross. And, asked him to come in and meet, which he did, and brought an amazing, series of images. And everyone was basically like, oh, well, it's Chris. And they were all sort of basically super delighted. And I guess that started then a run of sort of many, many years of work together. Chris, have I told that approximately correctly?
Is this how you remember it?
Yeah, totally. It's one of those things. It's totally not up to us as DPs to we get to choose what jobs we accept or not accept, but it's the directors that are in our lives that are the ones that really steer our careers. And Jay says exactly right. I was shooting, I think I was with Tech Wrecking with Owen Harris for the second block of the second season of Misfits, and Jay was one of the other directors, and we were talking about, even then, it was like 2010, I guess. That season, that show was shot on the Red One with a set of uncoated Zeiss Super Speed lenses, or the whole show pretty much at a T 1.3 and 2/3, T 2.1, something like that, for maximum flare. Well, actually not maximum flare, but for just the right level of flare and kickback and whatever. Anyway, I was quite right to be nice to an enthusiastic young director, because I'm an enthusiastic young DP, and we see the world in a very similar way. So it was the start of whatever that is, 14 years of friendship.
And I would say also it's a funny thing where, as Chris says, like, I feel like, DPs often, they have the power of saying yes or no, but like it's sort of, they're coming on board with the directors. But actually, I would say we're in the rare scenario maybe of like, because of telly, Chris was doing a show, the show we did after Top Boy together. Chris was doing a show with Danny Boyle. And I did feel like Chris was very instrumental in that. I'd met Danny before on something, but Chris was shooting that, and there's no doubt, like, he was a big part of me getting on that gig. And that was such a fun one to do, where I got to follow Danny and Chris working together, and got really, because Chris and I were good friends, I then got to really see how, and Danny is so open and generous, I really got to see how they were working together, and then sort of take that and do our own episodes. And they're still sort of, in a way, some of my favorite things that we did together, because they are really quite nuts. I feel like those 2 episodes that we did of TV were sort of, it was basically us going, oh, what would be fun? How do we tell this story in the most interesting way? So I think we've had, and then that all translated obviously into Shōgun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The perfect segue. You two worked on the first 2 episodes, and we talk a lot about endings and getting those right, but not enough about starting it right, especially with TV shows where if you don't start well, don't hit the right note straight from the beginning, you lose the audience, and that's it. Especially because the first 2 chapters were released at the same time, followed by the third one only a week later. So finding the look, setting the tone, and the general conflict, primarily this is what we get in the first 2 episodes. First of all, how much time did you have for prep, and what do you feel like was that enough for?
So, we had, I feel like the prep was pretty generous. It had been a long gestation period. I think the project had been 9 years in the making at FX. And I think, when I came on, Justin and Rachel, who were the showrunners, had been on it already for about 4 years. So we came in, and I would say Chris was right behind me on it. While I was interviewing the job, I'd already knew that I wanted to shoot it with Chris. I'd rung him about it, like checking that he was free. We'd started talking about references, that I then put in my lookbook. He was immediately flagging, some really interesting stuff for me. We talked about Blade Runner. We talked about, Raise the Red Lantern, Apocalypse Now, The Revenant. And those were things that were already sort of dropping in, literally as I was getting the job. And then Chris very shortly afterwards also came on board. And so we then went out to Vancouver pretty quickly and got involved in, there were some set designs, but they were still, they definitely were in flux, and we were trying to work out, how to maximize those spaces, how to differentiate them. And Chris can speak to this, about allowing more natural light in. That was definitely the feel of how the Japanese spaces worked back then. And then, just really on my end, it was the casting and, definitely starting to think about the look, starting to think about the textures and the costumes and all of that. But Chris, Chris was absolutely, Justin and Rachel, obviously the showrunner, were really behind it all. But Chris was really coming in there as sort of a big visual partner to me, and knowing, someone who I just trust so much, and being able to talk about the color of the costumes, the palette, the textures, what the walls should be, what the paintings, I think all of it, in the best possible scenario, everyone's hand in hand in that. And it really felt like we were, you're a team through to right when you begin to shoot.
I was on a project in Turkey, just coming to the end of a film towards the middle of the summer, or the start of the summer in 2021. And, so I think I came over with about 10 weeks before shooting, maybe 12 weeks before shooting. I remember having to be quarantined for a considerably long time in a random Vancouver apartment because there was still COVID precautions, etc. But like you were saying, Áron, it's a really difficult process that you have to go through, because there's no cast. There's some suggestions. There's no cast. There's if you're lucky, an amazing bunch of concept art drawings from the art department, but there are no sets that have been built or created. And so you're trying to balance, and the costumes are mid process. And so you're trying to juggle all of these elements from all of the collaborators, and by tying in all of the work from all of the collaborators, you're effectively, if you're doing it well, you're pulling all of the looks into one place. You're pulling all of the color palettes into a unified universe. You're pulling all of everyone's work is coming from the same direction. And I think that was something that that obviously Justin and Rachel have been talking to all of the key creatives about for quite a long period of time. But as the process accelerates into production, you have a lot of decisions to make and a lot of people to advise as to how you want the show to look. You know, one of the things that Jay and I worked on as soon as we started the process was a mood film of references that help all of the collaborators have some idea as to how the camera will move, how the lighting will influence performance, what the atmosphere of the universe is like. And those the references that are in the mood film are really eclectic, and they come from every available place, you know, from Japanese cinema to American westerns to, you know, cross genre basically. But hopefully by watching that 3.5 minute reel, you as a collaborator get some sense of what Jay wants to produce in the show itself.
Yeah, and to that, I would say, you know, I think the hardest thing in a way that I found, and I'm sure for Chris as well, was that, you know, when you arrive, you realize this all takes place in 16th century Japan, and it was a really discovery of an embracing, I guess, of knowing what I didn't know. You know, it was, you know, what I didn't know was vast and still really is vast, and we were really lucky that we brought in a huge numbers of really, really great experts, not least Hiro Sanada, our lead producer, who was awesome at just sort of being very patient and also very diligent about making sure we had the authenticity, and that also that sort of helped the story. And that, you know, we also had a director called Mr. Arada, who was from Japan, who had directed a lot of Jidaideki movies. And he sort of, again, could kind of advise about what was acceptable in terms of authenticity, but also where it could be pushed. I would also meet with advisors. You know, I had a Kiko who was an advisor who would come in and was called a mistress of gestures. And she would advise Chris and Justin and I about where people could sit in a set. You know, it wasn't like you could block a scene as you normally would, where you just say, well, this person can walk here and this person can sit there. And, you know, we had to very carefully consider the rooms, and even in pre-production, consider the rooms, because how Chris could like them and where everyone could sit all had to be dovetailed, because it wasn't like shooting something in the contemporary, you know, 21st century New York, where they can just walk over to the window and do whatever. People sat in a very formal way. People moved in a very formal way. And so it was also, that was part of it. And it was leaning into that. I think actually that's some of my favorite things are where we've discovered shots and ways of filming it, because it is set up and choreographed differently to how most things are filmed. But it was definitely a lesson in going, wow, this is not how you would usually conceive of something, because of the period and because of the authenticity.
I don't want to be repetitive with questions like this, since I recently asked this in another interview, but I'm just so fascinated by this aspect of cinematography. And what I'm talking about is lighting and shooting scenes lit by fire or candles. For example, when the assassin attacks Toranaga, how do you achieve this vivid yet darker tone in the look while allowing the viewer to actually see what's going on the screen?
It's a challenge, that's for sure, whenever you have a sequence that's a bit like that. To be honest, it's a very, very long-winded answer, but at the very start of that question, the start of the answer to that question is starting with what does the shield look like in the first place? What is the space that is inhabited by these characters? And the brilliant production designer Helen Jarvis, she had been on the project for, I think, about a year by the time, because of the pandemic, because of the delay in shooting. I think she'd been working on the project for about a year and had a huge amount of art department drawings and concept art. And I think even by the time I'd arrived in Vancouver to start my prep, there were models of our three main sets that were built on sound stages. And so the first thing that I looked into was how the spaces were lit and what were the light sources of choice for the Japanese at the time. Did they have, the interesting thing is that as you can see from the show, is that they had these little tripod rapeseed oil lanterns that were saucers, porcelain saucers full of rapeseed oil with a single wick, and they were the predominant interior light source for the night work. And so because they're such a dangerous light source, basically if they get knocked over, they set fire to all of the rapeseed oil and you burn down the set. So we worked from the very beginning on creating an LED replica of those light sources. So an amazing practical team came aboard and built about 120 of those little tripod lights so that we could utilize them across all of the different sets. And then we cabled them into very specific positions. So I have a drawing of the set with all of the points in Toranaga's quarters where we thought we might need to place one of these lanterns. And so the way the lighting of that sequence is constructed is that we did an elaborate blocking rehearsal during, well before the shoot, maybe 2 weeks before the shoot, of the route that the assassin would take through the space. And by planning that out, I could work out where I could best silhouette the assassin with a well-placed lantern. So usually there's a lantern between, on the far side of the assassin or the far side of the character that is being photographed to etch their silhouette out of the background. And then there's another lantern below the frame somewhere that is giving me a catch light in the eye or an edge light on a cheek or something like that. And so really the lighting of the sequence is pretty simple. It's just done with those lanterns, or we built some, do you know the concept of a beauty dish that's used in stills photography? So we used beauty dishes with LED sources inside the beauty dish as a modeling light for some of the close-ups. But basically the lighting, there are no fixtures hanging in the ceiling or any of that sort of stuff. It's all done using the real lights as if it was a real environment. And I think that's what helps to make it feel sort of, real and truthful, is because there's very little artificial cheating of light sources in places that they couldn't exist, basically. And then toward the end of the sequence, the shogi screens are blasted open and the gardens are lit with the braziers. So they're the exterior light source of choice. And one of the things that Jay and I spoke about was wanting to avoid a sort of deep blue moonlight for the space. So in reality, we have a kind of charcoal green moonlight that then just gives a certain tone to the shadows, basically. But yeah, that was it. And the whole approach to the lighting of Shōgun, from my perspective, was to embrace the architectural idiosyncrasies of the buildings. So, as an example, to put it simply, the engawas and the verandas around the edges of the building eradicate all direct sunlight in the interiors, and the fact that the ceilings are wood paneled and the floor is made of tatami mats that are a sort of a cream fabric means that the idea of room tone and soft top light that we utilize all the time in Western cinematography is sort of inverted, because any ambient light is coming from the floor rather than from the ceiling. So in a way, it was trying to take a kind of Western camera operating aesthetic and partnering it with a Japanese light aesthetic. And that's I think the unique combination and juxtaposition that is what enables Shōgun to be that little bit different.
And then, of course, for you, Jay, comes in the additional responsibility as a co-executive producer. How has this affected your relationship with the show?
I think in many respects, what that does is actually, I think it feels much more like, because in British TV, you come in and you're given quite a lot of responsibility, because really when I was starting out, they weren't really showrunners, that you were just there and you were kind of left to your own devices to make it. And you sort of had to think about where the show would go. You had to think about your episodes. And, now obviously, because there is a showrunner, and because Justin and Rachel are there and they can kind of oversee it, and Callan and Sophie and, everyone else, really what I find is that actually it's just me tuning into some of those muscles that I had from British TV, just thinking about like, okay, where does this story go? Like Chris was saying, just holding those arcs in my head. Just, I think both of us, when you start a show, and really, I guess that's where that executive producer title comes from with starting it. I think Chris had to pass on the baton to the other DPs. I was passing on the baton to the other directors. And I think we both just felt a lot of responsibility for that the show had to be set up in a way that it would continue without us, that, you're sort of handing over something that you feel quite emotionally attached to, because you've kind of set this whole thing up, but also it's just got to go on. And obviously Justin and Rachel, and, they've really got their hands on that tiller. But I think both Chris and I realized that we had a real responsibility to see that arc through on our ends and in our department. So I think that's where it really came from, was just making sure you got a real overview of the whole thing, and you're not just coming in and going, oh, well, it's my episode, I've done it, good luck to you all. You feel like a responsibility, and through all the posts and everything, I was watching cuts and looking at VFX, and, we were talking about the color, and, so you just have a broader arc to the show, the longer timeline.
What I'd really like to get both your insights and opinions on are the scenes where an interpreter is needed for John Blackthorne, and like you had to have the actors facing each other, the one who is currently interpreting facing half here, half there, turning one way, yet at the other, all while sitting or on their knees. I might have just picked up on a not so noticeable or on the nose aspect, but I'd guess a rather significant parts of your jobs. Can you walk us through this segment of the show a little bit?
I mean, we talked in, and Chris can really speak to some of the lensing and things like this on it. But I think we really talked right from the beginning, and it was implicit in Justin's script as well. It's like, whose story is this? That it feels very subjective, and we knew we wanted it to feel subjective, but in a really fun way. There's this wrestle for subjectivity. It's like a battle for whose scene these are. And, I think the difference between the way we told it and the original miniseries is that in the original miniseries, it's very clear who the story's perspective is from. Whereas in ours, it is definitely, there is a certain element of a stranger in a strange land, but also it's also seen where it's not just his viewpoint, it's the Japanese viewpoint of looking at him and going, no, you're the barbarian, you're the foreigner, like, who the hell are you? And I think what was really fun was a scene like the one you're talking about, where Blackthorne and Toranaga first meet. It really epitomizes that wrestling for whose story is this? Who is that? Who is in charge? Who is in power of this? And I think obviously we've had many, many stories where it is the colonial savior. And I think what's great about ours is that isn't the case. Like, actually, the person whose story it is Toranaga's. And that's what makes it so intriguing in Mariko's. And yes, it is also Blackthorne's, but it is not definitively his. And so I think that was a scene where we really thought about how we lens it and how we choreograph it to show this duality of storytelling.
Yeah, well, I think it's exactly that. I think I spoke about this in another interview. one of the things that was interesting about the first season of the TV show Misfits that I worked on, that I met Jay on, was that in the third episode of the first series, two of the main characters end up essentially as boyfriend and girlfriend. But if you track back all of the scenes that they're on screen together, they don't ever speak. They never uttered a word just to each other in 3 episodes of television. But in the third episode, they're boyfriend and girlfriend. And so in order to generate that relationship, the framing of each of those characters' work was framed from the perspective of the other character. So so that's kind of the lensing technique of those scenes with the interpreter, is that there's a subtext of connection between the characters that isn't necessarily overt. These two characters are having a conversation, but these other two characters are becoming interconnected. And so, as well as a standard, straightforward frontal close-up that lends into the subjectivity of the scene and gives one character sort of prominence in the scene or dominance over another character, there's also peripheral photography that sets up sideline relationships. And I think, going back to your first question, as well as setting up a universe, setting up the idea of what 1609 or 1604 looks like to a contemporary audience, the other thing you have to do in the first few episodes of a series is to explain to an audience who everybody is and what are all of their relationships. And there's something like 60 characters that you meet in the course of the first 2 episodes of Shōgun. And you have to know who is who, what relationship they have to each other, why that relationship matters, and some form of projection moving forwards as to where this relationship, whether it be about where this relationship is going in 3 episodes time, 5 episodes time. It's not massively important, but it is significant that you sow these tiny seeds of connectivity so that long term, who is spying on who is an ally of who. And I think that was something that I think we did reasonably well in the show.
Yeah, I think there was a real sense. I think, especially in TV, it can arc towards coverage, it can arc towards conventionality. And I think Chris and I really, along very much with the sport of Justin, were sort of approached it going, especially in those first 2, where, as Chris says, you're setting up a huge number of relationships and sort of dynamics and, tensions, that I think we really wanted to film it in a very, very specific way that capture that, that it wasn't conventional coverage. So obviously, we were shooting with 2 cameras and, you are running scenes, but like it really was, even those sitting down scenes that, maybe in a slightly different production might be a little more casual. Even those were very, very carefully planned out down to sort of, where the eye line is. And that was, that for me gave it a sort of precision that was really exciting.
John Blackthorne being stranded and kept hostage among people where barely no one speaks English and some Portuguese. Language barriers are all over the show, and we know that languages aren't just like our mother language, but, for example, the film world has its language and every department has its own. How do you remember your first days in the industry, on set, finding your place, common ground, and even language with your colleagues?
On my first professional set, I feel like I had spent quite a lot of time hearing people tell me that I wasn't in film school anymore. Was my general experience, was sort of very, very old British crews going, "You're not in film school anymore," and me going, "No, I know." I'm very painfully aware of that. It was, I was very lucky. I got to, something that England really does afford is it's got a great feeder sort of program into professionalism and into the TV world. Particularly, there was a program called Coming Up on Channel 4 where, they took young directors and writers and basically got them to write and direct 25 minutes of TV. They got really good actors to be in it. And sort of, an okay budget, and you'd go off and you would film for 5 days on a TV schedule with the full professional TV crew. I was paired with, a good DP, a good first AD, grip and gaffer, something that making my own shorts I hadn't really experienced. And it was a real baptism of fire. You had to shoot, you had to make your days, you had to do it. And in a way, they used it as a calling card for you. So if you could kind of do that, something like Misfits could then ask, they had some way of checking on you that wasn't just your short films. They could go, okay, so we know he's artistically can do it, but can he sort of function on a set? And that was a great sort of calling card for that. And it existed almost for that very purpose. But in many respects, I found subsequently that actually, especially working with Chris, who's like, it's just working with like a great friend and a brother. Like the truth is it doesn't feel that being on the set of Shōgun, to me, doesn't feel that different to being on the set of Top Boy or something like that. Even though the scale is substantially different, the pressures are all sort of the same, but also the family and the humor and the sort of, the basically that we are trying to make art feels the same. You just don't want to look behind you and see a 1,000 person crew. But really, the way we do it feels still very, very similar. Like it doesn't. So I've sort of tried to keep it that way going forward and not get too bogged down in sort of, I don't know, a rigid idea of how it should be done and the sort of structure of the film industry.
Yeah, I think the scale that you end up shooting at, the core group of filmmakers is the same. You have a close relationship with the designer, the costume designer, the sound recordist, the DP, the editor, etc. And as the scale gets bigger, those people get more people, but the core team stays roughly the same sort of scale. You end up with 10 sparks on the main unit rather than, when I on Misfits, we'd have 4 sparks on an average day and no rigging team of any kind. And on the Shōgun, I would have 8 sparks on a regular day and a rigging team of another 8. So, you end up being, a huge unwieldy beast, but the core creative team generally stays roughly about the same. And it's just communication from that core team that changes.
Yeah, and it definitely is. Like, I'm still sort of delighted and amazed that often, like on Shōgun, it would be just me, Hero, Chris, and Justin standing on a set, sort of going, so what works here? What should be there? Or, Cosmo and Anna sort of saying, oh, there's a humor here, Justin coming on, I think we can make this funnier. Like, is there, that it's still, I think the process can feel very mystifying from the outside, but in fact, I think when people come and see it, it's actually quite demystifying. It really is just people just working out, you're not building a car, you're trying to build a little piece of art. So you're just talking that through. And, even though there's, like Chris says, it's really the main thing is the vast amount of communication that needs to be had before you get to that moment where you're standing on set.
Shooting with horses sure has its difficulties logistics-wise, plus it brings sort of change to perspective or viewpoint due to the hate difference it creates with others. And this made me think of the scenes where in the early stages the prisoners are kept down there in a hall, or even just when the superior person sits a bit higher than the inferior one. What ways could you and can you visually showcase certain human relationships and among those power dynamics?
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that best shows that power dynamic is shifts of perspective. Whether you're viewing someone from behind somebody else, so you're putting the camera in the over the shoulder of a character and telling the audience that you're centering the scene around this one character. to choices of lens. The generally the wider angle the lens that you utilize, the more projected the perspective is. And so you might want to look up at someone with a lens of projected perspective and make them feel dominant, or you may want to look down on someone with the same technique. So really it's about trying to, rather than record, I think what's important about the way that Jay likes to work and likes to use me as a tool in the work that we do together is that, you can simply aim at a camera with a standard lens on, and that will be a sort of a representation of their performance and their place in the world that you're trying to create. But by jumping up and down the focal lengths of lens choices from a wide lens to a very long lens, what you say about that character, what you say about the audience's relationship with that character changes enormously. And so what I hope audiences respond to, in the whole season of Shōgun, is how those lens choices modulate across the 10 episodes and how the various directors and DPs put the audience in the shoes of each of the characters, basically. This dueling for subjectivity is such an important tool in the grammar of Shōgun, so that the audience knows who the scene centers around. And I think that's it's one of the reasons why the power dynamic of the show is so evocative to an audience.
Chris, as far as I know, you're currently shooting The Day of the Jackal, starring Lashana Lynch and Andy Redmayne.
Yeah. Well, I shot that for basically all of last year. I shot the first 3 episodes with director Brian Kirk in Budapest. And now at the moment I am in very grey Cologne, having just finished the Finland leg of a feature film called The Fisherwoman with the same director, Brian, starring Emma Thompson. So, no rest here for us wicked types.
And as for you, Jay, is the Blade Runner series what's next for you, or
that's what I'm currently prepping. Blade Runner in Prague and Barcelona.
And will that see you two teaming up once again?
It is not us teaming up on that, but I would kill to work with Chris again, obviously. And I'm really hoping. I'm working on a feature. That's what I like. I think it would be very cool for Chris and I, for me particularly, to get to make a feature with Chris. So that's my kind of that's what I'm holding a candle for maybe the end of this year or next year. If Chris has a window, that's what I'm going for.
Well, and seeing what
of course, I'll always be
done together.
Yeah.
I really hope that it can happen.